History, huh? Fuck, I don't want to know anything anymore. This is a world where nothing is solved. When someone once told me time is a flat circle. Everything we've ever done or will do, we're gonna do over and over and over again. Again. And again. And again. Forever.
We're going into the Fade, aren't we?
Hello, it's me again. Great news, because of wonderful government cutbacks, I lost my day job. Money-wise, not so good, but time-wise, oh. So over the next couple of months, I finally have time to focus on this channel, which is honestly nice and in the long run, probably a good thing, so you're not gonna hear me complain. Unlike almost 88% of the people who watched the Dragon Age The Veilguard review. Oh boy. Something tells me Bioware and EA didn't exactly envision this outcome when they came up with their absolutely hilarious "he's right behind me, isn't he, they can fly now, we're going into the Fate, aren't we?" Marvel-esque Star Wars slop hero shooter trailer. Now, to their benefit, they quickly adjusted and just a few days ago released another trailer that was much more in line with what we expect from Dragon Age. Overall, people actually seem to like this one a lot more. Now, it's easy to hate on things and be negative, but that's not what we're here for. I genuinely love Dragon Age. But watching that first Veilguard trailer and then the quick redirect to another much better trailer brought back some nasty memories. Because believe it or not, this isn't the first time something like this happened. We've been here before. In 2011, the year of Skyrim, Arkham City, Dead Space 2 and Portal 2, there should have been another juggernaut of a game that could have set the industry on fire. Dragon Age 2, however, somehow managed to do the exact opposite, but it wasn't really the game's fault. To illustrate that, we have to start at the very beginning. Now bear with me, this is gonna be a long one, another review in the traditional sense, but I promise, it'll all make sense at the end. In 1995, in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, 3 recently graduated medical students called Ray Musica, Greg Zetchuk, and Augustine Yip developed a medical simulation program which became a huge success. To keep their minds clear during development, the 3 friends played video games, and that gave them an idea. Alongside Greg's cousin Marcel and the brothers Trent and Brent Osner, they used the profits of their software program to launch their own video game studio. Bioware was born. Their first game, Shattered Steel, which released in 1996, was a Mac simulation game for MS-DOS. They sent a demo to Interplay, who you'll probably remember from our Wasteland 3 video, and the rest was history. However, during development, the young company immediately faced huge internal struggles, which had the brothers Trent and Brent, I know, it sounds like a soap opera, leave the company before the game even hit the market. Within a year, Trent came back to finish the game he started working on, and Shattered Steel got pretty favorable reviews and was a moderate success, but it was nothing compared to what was coming. Bioware began working on a game called Battleground Infinity, but Black Owl, a subdivision of Interplay, convinced them that the demonstrated gameplay engine could possibly work well in a D&D environment. So the doctors took their Infinity engine, reworked it with the Dungeons & Dragons rule set, and the result changed the world of CRPGs forever. On December 21st of 1998, Baldur's Gate saw the light of day. The game takes place in the Forgotten Realms, a high fantasy campaign setting. Baldur's Gate focused on the west coast of Faerun, a terrain including multiple forests, mountains, ruins, towns, and of course the majestic city of Baldur's Gate itself. Ray Musica and Greg Zetchuk recruited a writer named James Olin to help them design the world of Baldur's Gate. James originally ran a comic book store and 2 Dungeons & Dragons campaigns that were so popular they had a waiting list to keep up with the demand. Baldur's Gate was an immense success, both critically and commercially. The funny thing is, during the development of this all-time classic, the 3 doctors would continue practicing medicine while working on the game on their own time. Needless to say, the story is filled with mystery, intrigue, well-developed characters, beautiful writing, captivating dialogue, choices, consequences, and companions. Because this is where the typical Bioware staple began. There were two things that set Baldur's Gate apart from all the other CRPGs at the time, and one of those were the party interactions. The many companions that could join your party up to 6 had their own personality, goals, and things to say about the world and the actions you took in it. Not only was this revolutionary, but it also made the game feel actually alive. What also set it apart was the combat. Baldur's Gate used the 2nd edition Advanced Dungeons & Dragons rule set and modified it to work with real-time with pause. The isometric Infinity engine gave the player a strategic look at the playing field, and even though the combat was essentially turn-based behind the scenes, it gave more control to the player by manually being able to pause. Which brings us to the freedom you had as a player to traverse the world. You could go anywhere, explore every nook and cranny of the various and diverse environments at your own pace in a non-linear way. Cities, mountains, towns, forests, caves, dungeons, it was all here. You could do this in older CRPGs like Wasteland or Fallout, but the way the world was integrated in Baldur's Gate made it seamless. Every location was handcrafted and unique. The city of Baldur's Gate felt like an actual living, breathing city, and you, as the player, were merely one of its many inhabitants. You were in control, at all times, of the quests, the characters, the combat, the equipment, everything. Now, at the time of release in 1998, I was a snotty little boy with little to no money. But I did have a subscription to PC Gamer magazine, and included with that magazine was a monthly demo disc. Now one day, one of those discs included a non-interactive demo, which is a very fancy way of saying video, for Baldur's Gate. I was blown away. I needed to get my hands on this game. As a huge Lord of the Rings fan, this seemed like everything I ever dreamed of. So I did what every snotty little boy would do, and begged my parents.
I begged you! I begged you, Dan! I begged you!
Sadly, they didn't understand how important this was to me, so they gave me no choice. I had to escalate things and got my grandma involved.
I hate being alive! I hate being alive! I hate breathing! I hate being alive! I'm in tremendous pain! I'm in tremendous pain! Help me! Help me!
Same
help.
tactic, but sadly also the same result, because somehow she didn't get it either. These people, man. But luckily, my older brother did. He was the one who got me into video games in the first place. So for my birthday that year, he gave me enough money to buy one video game, but gave me clear instructions to get Final Fantasy VII for PC. I didn't. I got Baldur's Gate. Now, our family computer at the time was a Pentium 166 MHz with a 500 megabyte hard drive. Windows 98 took up 200 megabytes, but Baldur's Gate required at least 320. So in my infinite childhood wisdom, I deleted Windows 98 from our family computer. Now, as you can imagine, the game kinda needed Windows to even run, and my parents were extremely happy with me. So I didn't actually get to play Baldur's Gate until the Christmas of 1999 when we got a new computer. Baldur's Gate surpassed any projections BioWare, Black Owl, or Interplay had for the game. So much so that they immediately started working on a full-blown expansion called Tales of the Sword Coast. The lead programmer for this project was a young man called Mark Dara, and he'll become very important later on. Tales of the Sword Coast released 1 year later to much success. That same year, in 1999, Black Owl used the Infinity engine BioWare developed to develop another CRPG that would stand the test of time and is still being revered as one of the best written games of all time, Planescape Torment. And only 1 year later, in 2000, Black Owl managed to do it again and released a more combat-focused Icewind Dale. Meanwhile, BioWare were itching to get back into the action genre. Now, at this point, Augustine Yip, one of the 3 founding doctors of BioWare, decided he already had enough of video game development and went back to practicing medicine full-time, while his 2 friends, Ray Musica and Greg Zetchuk, did the exact opposite. They left medicine behind and became full-time developers and now wanted to make a sequel to the 1997 third-person action shooter MDK, originally developed by Shiny Entertainment. They hired a mechanical engineer called Casey Hudson as a technical artist to work on the game, and in March of the year 2000, MDK2 was unleashed onto the public. Just like its predecessor, MDK2 was a third-person shooter, but the difference was that certain levels were reserved for one of 3 particular characters. You could play as Kurt from the previous game, Max, a robotically engineered dog, or Dr. Fluke Hawkins. Each character had different abilities you could use to stop the alien invasion, and the mechanics were much more refined and expanded upon than in the first game. MDK2 released on PC, Dreamcast, and later even the PlayStation 2. Critically and commercially, the game was a big hit, but nothing compared to what was to come next. Because later that year, in September, Bioware released Baldur's Gate 2. To this day, to many people, including myself, the greatest RPG of all time. Everything that made the original Baldur's Gate so good was improved and turned up to 100. The best character development I've ever seen in a game, where companions actually felt like real people with their own accents, motivations, quests, and loyalties. You could shape the way their personal stories and therefore personalities would turn out and evolve over the course of the game. What seemed like almost endless quests had their own branching stories that would lead to other side quests, and the world of Baldur's Gate 2 was downright magnificent. The whole city of Athkatla, where a large portion of the game takes place, felt alive, brimming with atmosphere and unique NPCs at every corner. It was divided into multiple districts, which all felt distinct and highly different from each other. You had the Bridge District, where the underworld of the city operated, or the Government District, where that kind of speaks for itself. Even the Graveyard District had its own unique feel, soundtrack, and faction to choose between, which had huge consequences for the main quests. Multiple biomes, cities, towns, dungeons, caves, forests, mountains, towers, and islands to explore. Hell, at some point you even get to visit an underwater city. And again, each of these locations was unique, different, and handcrafted. Player freedom was the key here. You could go anywhere at any time, do as you please. Become your character. You even got a stronghold that was personalized to the class you were playing. Baldur's Gate 2 truly had it all, and in my opinion has never been surpassed. Once again designed by James Olin, with Mark Dara as the lead programmer and Casey Hudson as a technical artist, Bioware hired a young new writer called David Gator to help them further pin down the story and develop a couple of the many companions in the game. Together, these gentlemen crafted a game that took the world by storm, was a tremendous success, and to this day, the template for every CRPG made afterwards. Now, this is highly embarrassing, but when the game released, I had grown into a moody bastard teenager. Everyone and everything was stupid, except for Baldur's Gate 2. So an entire year, I spent all the time I could possibly spare in Faerun. Hundreds of hours, nothing else mattered. Only Baldur's Gate 2. So my school results were not great. And when my parents found out, they sat me down, and I wasn't gonna get out of there without giving them a reason for these bad results. Telling them the truth would mean they'd take away my computer, so I did the right thing and told them I had a drug addiction instead.
It was the medication that did it!
So good parents as they were, they sent me to see a therapist.
Go fuck yourself!
Many counselor sessions and copying later, I was in the clear and everyone was very proud of me. I told you, I was a bastard back then. Now that I think about it, both Baldur's Gate 1 and 2 caused my family a lot of issues, but... well, I guess it was my fault, but... continuing on. Now you might be thinking, get on with it. What's with the endless history lesson, where the hell is Dragon Age 2? But it's important to acknowledge what these people accomplished before things got messy. Because believe me, it will get messy. For instance, you'd think the success of MDK2 and Baldur's Gate 2 would set Interplay up for huge financial success. But as we already covered in the Wasteland 3 video, that sadly couldn't be further from the truth. In 2002, Interplay lost the publishing rights to Bioware's next game and also sold their D&D license to Bioware themselves. Infogrames, which would later become Atari, published Bioware's Neverwinter Nights, which was another D&D game set in the Forgotten Realms. The Infinity engine had gotten old and needed to be retired, or so they thought. The Aurora engine was the next step and could feature full 3D environments. Now, the Neverwinter Nights campaign was moderately successful, even though it mostly served as a tutorial for the many mechanics in the game, but the multiplayer is where it truly thrived. Multiple official campaign module expansions were made, or you could even download player-based modules online. And just like with all their previous games, player freedom was once again the key here. Neverwinter Nights was yet another big success story for Bioware, but it's their next one that finally got them a seat at the big boys table. Consoles were on the rise, and Bioware were going to capitalize on it. Published by LucasArts as an Xbox exclusive, although it would also come to PC a few months later, Star Wars: Knights of the Old Republic, which released in the spring of 2003, was a revelation. To many people, including myself, still the best Star Wars game ever made, and definitely the best Star Wars story since the original trilogy. Let's not get into this. Technical artist Casey Hudson worked himself up to be the director of this project, with James Olin once again taking the role of lead designer and writer David Gator creating many of its original characters. Set 4,000 years before Luke Skywalker was drinking blue milk, Knights of the Old Republic, or KOTOR for easier use, was a Star Wars fan's dream. Just like Bioware handled immersion with the D&D license, you actually felt like your customizable character was part of the Star Wars universe. Every delicious, brilliant Bioware trope was present here, but in a Star Wars jacket, which was incredible. Multiple recognizable locations on various planets, interesting characters, distinguishable spaceships, and like I already mentioned, the main story was perfection personified. The combat was once again turn-based with pause, but this time with a third-person perspective, which made the game feel more cinematic and would become another template for many games to come. While my friends were having fun killing each other in Halo, I was saving the galaxy from Darth Malak. Or not, because KOTOR was one of the first games where a morality system actually mattered big time. Bioware's previous games also gave you the option to play as a bastard villain, but the choices and consequences were mostly binary. In KOTOR, however, picking the dark side would give you new, exciting, and different skills, while quests played out in different ways. Hell, the evil ending of KOTOR might even be better than the light side one. What Casey Hudson and his team created here was truly magical. Not only that, but it sold like hotcakes. So much so that it only took 4 days to completely sell out on shelves. And remember, this was before digital sales were even a thing or possible. Aside from the publishing issues, things couldn't possibly get any better for Bioware. But that's when Jade Empire happened. Now don't get me wrong, Jade Empire was a fantastic action RPG set in a world inspired by Chinese mythology, with Mark Dara once again as the lead programmer. To help them further pin down the story, Bioware hired video game reviewer Mike Laidlaw, who was previously working at the Adrenaline Vault. This was a great review site that existed from 1995 until it sadly closed down in 2013. Now, you'll recognize a lot of current-day noteworthy people in the games industry working at this site at the time. Jade Empire once again had all those great Bioware elements, fantastic characters, great story, interesting world and lore, many different locations, and actually new, fun, real-time action combat. But the problem was that it was solely console-focused. Published by Microsoft, it released in April of 2005 as an Xbox exclusive at the tail end of the OG generation. Only a few months later, the 360 would take the world by storm and Jade Empire was quickly forgotten about. Because of this, sales were low and it was considered a financial letdown. Bioware founder Greg Zetchuk would later state that it was a mistake not releasing the game as a 360 launch title, and a potential sequel was scrapped. That very same year, in November 2005, Bioware saw its first major shakeup at a corporate level. They joined forces with Pandemic Studios, which was founded by former Activision employees and made some pretty great games like Full Spectrum Warrior, Star Wars Battlefront, and Destroy All Humans. Both studios would keep their own branding, but were merged in a newly named VG Holding Corporate Partnership. What a name. At the time, this seemed like a great idea, which would benefit both studios immensely. And at first, it did, because 2 years later, in November of 2007, Commander Shepard took the command and never really let go. Once again published by Microsoft, so once again a console-focused Xbox exclusive, at least at the time of launch, Mass Effect took everything Bioware learned from all their previous games and poured it into what soon would become one of the greatest trilogies of all time. An epic main story, fantastically written companions, choices, consequences, player agency, and freedom, multiple unique planets and locations that felt alive and special. Hell, just look at the Citadel alone and how much love and work was poured into it to make it distinct from anything we'd seen before. Unique NPCs, quests, and secrets to find on multiple planets. Mass Effect was once again a gigantic success, both critically and commercially, and at the top of it all stood one man. In only a few years, Casey Hudson had worked himself up from a technical artist on MDK2 to directing KOTOR to helming an entire original IP in Mass Effect. He would never look back and stayed on the Mass Effect team for every sequel afterwards. Well, except for the one that wasn't all that great, but never mind. Bioware once again delivered, and nothing or no one would be able to stop them. And this is where the bad thing happened, because on October the 11th of 2007, it was announced that the VG Holding Corporation partnership was bought by Electronic Arts. This meant that both Bioware as well as Pandemic would now be units of EA, while still somewhat retaining their own branding. Now at the time, EA had already been at the center of numerous controversies involving acquisitions of studios just to get their hands on their IP and then closing them down. They were also in trouble because of a bunch of anti-consumer practices and even lawsuits alleging anti-competitive practices when it came to sports-related contracts. As you can imagine, people were not happy. The good news, however, was that Bioware already had 3 games in development, which EA couldn't get their grubby little hands on, except for the marketing. Now, the first of those 3 games wasn't even published by them, but it was also a bit of a weird one. Mark Dara had worked himself up to be the project director of Sonic Chronicles: The Dark Brotherhood for the Nintendo DS. Published by Sega, this was a Sonic turn-based role-playing game with rhythm and timing elements. It's weird. It released in 2008 to mixed reviews, but it did give Mark Dara the experience he needed as a project director and executive producer, something he would take with him to the next project they were working on. Now, at this moment in history, one major thing changed when it came to marketing games and movies. YouTube made it possible for publishers to directly reach the audience, and so the PC release of Mass Effect in 2008 was one of the first games to greatly make use of this new and exciting platform. The trailer for the PC release of Mass Effect was majestic, bombastic, cinematic, and perfectly showed what the game was all about. The marketing and online trailers did their job, so Bioware finally had their big original sci-fi epic, which sold extremely well, both on Xbox and now on PC. But there was something else brewing. 1 year later, in March of 2009, EA announced the opening of a new Bioware studio in Montreal. This one would assist the main studio in Edmonton on various projects. And only 2 months later, in June, EA also announced that one of their other studios, longtime developer Mythic Entertainment, which made the fantastic MMO Dark Age of Camelot, would be merged with Bioware, and that the new RPG MMO division, which was now called Bioware Mythic, was headed by Ray Musica, one of the founding doctors. Meanwhile, back in Edmonton, Bioware was finally ready to reveal what they had been secretly working on for all these years. This was the culmination of a decade of success, the crowning achievement of a group of extraordinary talented people who worked themselves up from the bottom to become certified game development legends. Produced by Mark Dara, designed by James Olin and Mike Laidlaw, and written by David Gator, Dragon Age Origins was the spiritual successor to Baldur's Gate. It was Bioware's very own The Lord of the Rings, and their first game, published by EA. This epic fantasy CRPG takes place in Ferelden, one of the countries in the fictional world of Thetis. Every few hundred years, the Darkspawn, evil creatures who dwell in the Deep Roads, come to the surface in an effort to take over the entire world. This event is called the Blight. Now, an order of legendary heroes of all races and classes called the Grey Wardens have managed to drive the Darkspawn back underground throughout the ages. Dragon Age Origins begins at the start of the 5th Blight. We get to pick one out of 6 completely original origin stories from 3 different races. It's a standard human, elf, dwarf, warrior, rogue, mage choice you get in a lot of other RPGs, but the major difference in Dragon Age Origins is that it actually matters. Your race and class determine where you are on the social and political ladder. Elves are viewed as slaves and second-class citizens compared to humans, while dwarves live a completely secluded life underground. But it's truly the mage class where things get really interesting and unique. In the world of Dragon Age, mages are dangerous. They have a connection to the Fate, the realm of spirits, and could easily get corrupted by it, causing them to get possessed by demons. To prevent this, the church, or in this case the chantry, keeps them in closely monitored groups called circles. In order to keep the order, every circle of mages is under control of the Chantry's military wing called the Templars. Their goal is to make sure the mages don't get possessed or escape, and if they do, hunt them down. This is so different from other fantasy RPGs, and it truly makes Dragon Age Origins stand out among the crowd. When Dragon Age Origins released, I had just graduated film school and was slowly getting used to my new life as a bum. Money was something other people had, and it didn't take long for my girlfriend at the time to realize this wasn't really going anywhere. So 2 days before the game came out, she broke up with me, which couldn't have worked out better, to be honest, because now, when my friends asked me to hang out with them, I had the perfect excuse to stay inside.
And she twisted my balls and my dick! And she told me that sex was disgusting and awful! And she told me that only disgusting, awful people had it!
Again, I know, what a douche, but for the entire month of November 2009, I was a Grey Warden. Now, as far as the plot of Dragon Age Origins is concerned, I don't want to delve too deep into it because you should definitely play and experience it for yourself. But after we complete our origin story, we get recruited into the Grey Wardens in an effort to stop the Fifth Blight. Once again, the typical beautiful Bioware tropes are all here. Fantastic lore and world building, interesting characters, villains, companions, fantastic dialogue, choices with huge world-changing consequences, political intrigue, betrayal, sacrifice, forgiveness, an enormous amount of unique handcrafted locations, going from forests to mountains to the wilds, deep roads, the Fate, the village of Lothering, Redcliffe Castle, and the city of Denerim. It's all here, and better than ever. And we got to explore it all freely. Now, Dragon Age Origins had a few things in common with the D&D rule set, but it's basically Bioware's own creation. Real-time with pause returned, and on PC you could essentially rotate the camera from a tactical isometric perspective, which made it look very similar to the old Infinity Engine games. However, as we already saw with Mass Effect, consoles were on the rise, so a port needed to be made for those as well, and this is where things took a weird turn. Because of hardware limitations, the PS3 and the Xbox 360 didn't have enough processing power for a lot of features that were originally present in Dragon Age Origins. It worked fine on consoles, but it was a bit of a downgrade from the PC version. And this is where EA marketing reared its ugly head for the first time, and why this history lesson was so important. Dragon Age Origins was a love letter to the CRPGs of old, but EA thought that console players couldn't deal with that. According to them, console players weren't interested in political intrigue, beautiful world building, and an epic story rivaling the best fantasy books out there. Nah. According to EA, console players wanted something else. Fast action, blood, gore, violence, and somehow, Marilyn Manson. So when one of the first trailers for Dragon Age Origins hit YouTube, a lot of old-time Bioware fans, including myself, were asking themselves, what the hell is this? Sure, it looked cool and flashy, but it was nothing like the actual game. Dragon Age Origins had a beautiful, majestic, epic soundtrack from composer Einon Zur, which not only enhanced the gameplay immensely, but was instantly iconic. And it was completely absent from that first trailer. It's honestly astonishing how much this parallels with current day events and the two-trailer situation for Dragon Age 4, because not long after that weird first Origins Marilyn Manson trailer, Bioware released another one called Sacred Ashes, which was much more in line with what people thought Dragon Age was going to be. An epic tale with a beautiful score. The only question was, which one of these two very different trailers was the right one? Which one showed us the actual game? Longtime Bioware fans, again, myself included, got a bit worried. It's only until we actually got to play the game in November of 2009 that we realized that Bioware did in fact get it right. Despite EA's weird marketing, this truly was the spiritual successor to Baldur's Gate, a CRPG in heart and soul, and something incredibly special. However, what wasn't very special nor surprising was what EA did next. Only 1 week after the hugely successful launch of Dragon Age Origins, EA shut down Bioware's former partner Pandemic Studios. The gloves were off. Now at this point, longtime Bioware veteran designer James Olin had left the core Dragon Age team and moved to Austin, Texas to set up a new studio for Bioware that would focus on developing their first ever MMO called The Old Republic. The rest of the team remained intact and immediately got working on the sequel, because EA had some hefty, unrealistic demands, which we'll get to in a second. Only 2 months after the launch of Dragon Age Origins, Bioware had another ace up its sleeve. Commander Shepard was back in one of the best sequels of all time. Casey Hudson and his team did it again and then some, because Mass Effect 2 was downright amazing. Released in January of 2010, which is a pretty unconventional release month, Mass Effect 2 launched on the Xbox 360 and PC, with the PS3 version following the next year. In a pretty short development cycle that was only 3 years long, Mass Effect 2 streamlined most of its predecessor's hardcore RPG elements and became more of a third-person action RPG. The reason for this was obviously consoles. Unlike Dragon Age Origins, however, the downgrade, in quotation marks, actually worked for Mass Effect. Now, I know a lot of people still prefer Mass Effect's hardcore nature, but turning it into a more of a Gears of War RPG hybrid worked really well for the sci-fi setting, and especially the more action-packed third-person shooter combat. All the popular and fantastic Bioware elements we've gone over plenty of times before in this video were once again present, but they really went the extra mile when it came to the biomes, environments, planets, and the companions in this one. Every location was unique, special, and served its purpose to the many characters in the main plot. It also did something revolutionary and let you import your save game with all your choices from the first game into the second game. Mass Effect 2 was a triumph. Now, there were a couple of annoyances. EA wouldn't be EA if they didn't try to squeeze as much money out of it as they possibly could. So they implemented the Cerberus network, an always online feature in Mass Effect 2 through which you could download an enormous amount of DLC. This mostly included a bunch of nonsense cash grab weapons and armor, but to be fair, also 2 awesome new companions and one of the best DLCs any game has ever seen in the quest The Lair of the Shadow Broker. The trailers for Mass Effect 2 were on point and made it clear what the game was about while showcasing its strength. Action-packed combat combined with an epic, planet-hopping sci-fi story, rivaling the best the genre had to offer. And now, my friends, we have finally arrived at the point when it all came crashing down. Because it was right here that EA's reign truly began, immediately after the launch of Dragon Age Origins. While the Golden Team was still hard at work at the expansion called Awakening, EA ordered Bioware to get the sequel ready. Not in 4 years, 3 years, or even 2 years, no. It needed to be ready now. EA gave them only 14 months to get Dragon Age 2 ready, so Mark Dara, David Gator, Mike Laidlaw, and their teams were in for a year of stress, crunch, and misery.
Why should I live in history, huh? I don't want to know anything anymore. This is a world where nothing is solved. When someone once told me time is a flat circle. Everything we've ever done or will do, we're gonna do over and over and over again. Again. And again. Forever.
Now, I did warn you at the start that this wasn't going to be a traditional review. However, it's important to delve a little bit deeper into Dragon Age 2 because the parallels to what's going on right now with the Veilguard are too big to ignore. When the game was first revealed on July 10 of 2010, with a release date of March 2011 attached to it, people couldn't believe what was going on. That's because they weren't stupid. There was no way the Dragon Age team, no matter how great and talented they were, could deliver a full-blown sequel in that short amount of time. That is until lead designer Mike Laidlaw explained why this could possibly work. Unlike Origins, Dragon Age 2 would focus on one set character called Hawk. He would be a human, negating the whole Origins part that made Dragon Age so special. The entire game would also take place in one location, the city of Kirkwall. This would give the team not only enough time to polish the game, but also implement the many choices and consequences we were used to from a Bioware game. What quickly became apparent was that most of the team, who were previously behind the scenes, were suddenly paraded in front of the camera to explain why Dragon Age 2 could possibly work. It was like they were in full damage control before the game was even a thing. And to be clear, this is not the development team's fault. Mike Laidlaw, David Gator, and Mark Dara clearly had the right intentions, and the whole team poured their heart and soul into the development of this game. By now you know the drill. EA and Bioware primarily focused on one thing: consoles. Once again, consoles. They seem to be Bioware's Achilles heel, and it never became more apparent than right here, because the whole marketing around Dragon Age 2 was focused on consoles and attracting a larger audience than a CRPG could ever pull in. No more isometric viewpoints or tactical camera positions. Flashier third-person combat, blood, gore, a higher focus on animations and graphical fidelity instead of raw gameplay was what they were going for. At the time of release, I had become a working man with enough money to spare to buy my own video games. As the proud team manager of a crappy call center, it was my job to motivate my team and get them to sell as many insurance policies as they possibly could.
Listen up, all you top G's.
We did great, top of the company, but after a while, my bosses sat me down and got really upset with me. How the hell was I supposed to know that motivating my team with alcohol was illegal?
Be a man!
So after I had to move in with my brother, he didn't understand why he had to buy me Dragon Age 2.
Because I lost my fucking job!
But anyway, the game. The premise of Dragon Age 2 is highly interesting. What makes it so unique is that we're seeing, or rather hearing, everything through the eyes of Varric, a dwarven rogue. He's being interrogated by Cassandra Pentagast, the right hand of the Divine, which is basically Dragon Age's version of the Pope. She wants to know everything there is to know about Hawke, our main character, because she believes his actions hold the key to preventing an all-out war on the entire continent. Having Varric be an unreliable narrator is a choice that works wonderfully. Right at the start, he describes Hawke in a way that seems way too unrealistic, which tells us that we shouldn't believe everything he says, or that we play for ourselves. Hawke's story begins during the events of Dragon Age Origins. When the Blight reaches his hometown of Lothering, Hawke, his mother, and his two siblings have no other choice but to flee. Now, despite us being stuck as playing as a human, we still get the choice between a warrior, rogue, or a mage. If you pick a warrior or a rogue, your brother Carver dies during the escape. However, if you pick a mage, which I would personally highly recommend in this game because of the lore, your sister Bethany gets the axe. This ensures that we get to Kirkwall with at least one mage and one warrior. To enter the city, however, we have to choose to enter the service of either a mercenary group or a bunch of smugglers. Once we make our choice, 1 year passes. Because the passage of time is the special sauce of Dragon Age 2. The whole game takes place in and around the city of Kirkwall in the Free Marches, which we'll see change over the years according to our actions. The premise of Dragon Age 2 was amazing, but the execution sadly left a lot to be desired. Once the game's prologue is over and we're truly living inside the city of Kirkwall, it immediately becomes clear where the corners were cut to get Dragon Age 2 out as soon as possible. Remember the three staples we've seen over and over again in every Bioware game before: player freedom, party interactions, and unique locations. If you haven't played it yet, it might shock you to learn that none of these are present here. Now, just like in Baldur's Gate 1 and 2, the city and its surrounding area are divided into multiple districts, which you can visit either during the day or at night. The problem, however, is that the streets in these districts or the surrounding hills and mountains pretty much all look the same and are completely devoid of life, immersion, and freedom. You basically run from one exclamation mark NPC on the map to the next one, turning in quests, getting pretty much meaningless loot that all looks kinda drab, and XP to fill out your predetermined Ubisoft skill tree. Every once in a while, one of your companions will let you know they want to talk to you with yet another giant marker, so you click on them, preferably in a tavern where the animations actually work, so they can tell you what they need or to give you some exposition about their personality. This is how you bond with them, because they've all got relationship meters where you can track how well you're doing. This is sadly not an exaggeration, but literally what you'll be doing for most of the game. Unless you're fighting, that is. Combat in Dragon Age 2 is entirely in third person, which does make it look more cinematic, and the combat skills you get, especially as a mage, are fun to use and highly powerful. The problem, however, is that it once again becomes abundantly clear where corners were cut, because during these combat encounters, enemies will just spawn in out of nowhere. This not only makes the combat less strategic, but it also turns it into some kind of weird malfunctioning horde mode. It has kinda cheap MMO tendencies, including the typical toolbar cooldowns that you wouldn't expect in a game like this. Now these all sound like major negatives, and trust me, they are. So the question is Dragon Age 2 truly just a bad, rushed game? According to the user score on Metacritic, yes. Yes it is. But if you're asking me personally, no. It's amazing. Despite the obvious cut corners in both the environments and the gameplay, the story, characters, lore, and time gimmick of Dragon Age 2 are downright brilliant. Now the initial offset of the story might have a slow burn, but before you know it, you're in the middle of what will become a huge full-scale war between the Templars and the Mages, all while trying to fend off a Qunari invasion, and dealing with personal family problems galore. Anders, one of the characters of the Origins expansion Awakening, returns in Dragon Age 2 and becomes one of your companions. This deserter Grey Warden stands in the middle of the conflict and is always on the verge of escalating it. Meanwhile, Aveline, who you met during your escape from Lothering, becomes the city guard captain, while your brother Carver, again if you pick to be a mage at the start, might become a Templar. There's also Fenris, a fugitive Tevinter warrior who therefore hates mages, and Meryl, a young Dalish blood mage who's looking for herself. Rounding out the cast are Isabella, a former pirate captain and probably my favorite, and Varric, who's our narrator. Now as you can tell, all of these companions are basically polar opposites. It's a cast of beautifully written characters, each with their own opposing morals, principles, and ways to convince them to see things your way. Because Hawk, our character, also has his own personality. Throughout the course of the game, you can typically pick between 3 personality traits: the honorable hero, the sarcastic jester, and the disgruntled anti-hero. Now, I know what you're thinking, this didn't work in Fallout 4, why would it work here? But it does, because even Hawk is written in a way that makes sense to the character, what he's been through, and where he's going. He doesn't want to be the champion of Kirkwall or the hero of our story, which is exactly what makes him so compelling. I want to spoil as little of the main story here as I can, but Red Lyrium plays a huge part in it. It corrupts the Templars and makes them just as dangerous as the mages they're supposed to protect the world from, so it truly blurs the lines between what is right and what is wrong. Knight Commander Meredith is a complicated character who's not a villain in a traditional sense, but more of a tragic former hero who's simply afraid of matters she doesn't understand. We deal with her throughout the game, and the adversarial relationship between her and Hawk shape a large portion of the story. The same can be said about the Arashok, the Qunari leader who got stranded in Kirkwall after a storm destroyed his fleet. The many interactions between him and Hawk, and the way it all culminates in a couple of the hardest decisions in the entire trilogy. As we've seen in the main game, relatable and 3-dimensional villains are always the most interesting. There's also 6 DLCs that later got added to the game, like the Black Emporium, which was basically an extra store specializing in unique items, your new companion Sebastian, and a bunch of new loot. Apart from that, after replaying the entire game again for the first time since 2011, it became very clear to me that Dragon Age 2 was done dirty. If Bioware had been given time to develop more diverse environments, expand on the combat, the skill trees, and the basically non-existent exploration aspects, the game would have been universally loved. Sadly, the exact opposite happened. People weren't having it, and you can't blame them because the initial impression the game makes is simply not good. It's only after you push through that it becomes great and you realize it might be one of the better games of that generation. There were also glaring issues outside of the game. For instance, Valve actually removed Dragon Age 2 from Steam because it was selling in-game DLC, which was against their terms of service. A few other scandals were surrounding the game, but the most damning one was a Bioware employee who got caught giving the game a 10 out of 10 on Metacritic, inflating the score before that was the norm. These days, that probably wouldn't be as big of a deal anymore and games get review bombed left and right, but back then, it was a big deal. So just like that initial trailer for Dragon Age the Veilguard did, Dragon Age 2 left a sour taste in people's mouths. It wasn't marketed right, the development issues and time crunch behind it became the story, so the audience, perhaps rightfully so, didn't want to give it a chance. We can see the same thing happening right now with the Veilguard. Even though there are obvious, glaring problems in hindsight, Dragon Age 2 deserved much more credit, and the Golden team working on it definitely did. But it sadly also started a downward spiral. After Dragon Age 2, Bioware was never really the same. There were still a couple of success stories to come, but each of them was tainted by public outrage, development issues, or unsustainable profit projections. The critics still largely showed up, the money was still coming in, but the love and adoration of the public they so carefully gathered over the years seemed to keep waning with every new release. On December 20th of 2011, Bioware Austin released their first ever MMO called The Old Republic. It started off extremely strong, peaking at 1.7 million subscribers, but because of a lack of endgame content, the subscription number fell below 1.3 million by May 2012. And by July, that number had already fallen under a million, prompting EA to quickly shift their strategy and making the game free to play. They stated that it needed at least 500k subs to remain profitable, and this was the only way to attain that number. The game was called KOTOR 327 all in one, but the problem was that it was a great single player game packaged as an MMO, so in the end, neither genre could truly flourish. Now again, don't get me wrong, personally I love The Old Republic, and I've spent hundreds of hours in it, but generally speaking, people weren't as happy with it as EA or Bioware wanted them to be. And the same thing could be said about their next one. Mass Effect 3, which released on March 6, 2012 on both consoles and PC, was a great game and a worthy successor to one of the best third-person action RPGs of all time. But it also left people baffled. At the very end of the trilogy, it looked like most of your choices didn't really matter. It all came down to 1 out of 3 optional endings, which you picked right before the final cutscene, and that was basically it. A pretty large portion of the audience was vocally outraged and called for a different ending. The term entitled gamers was coined, and this truly marked the start of the adversarial relationship between developers, games media, and gamers. Later that year, the inevitable happened. On September 18 of 2012, the 2 remaining doctors and founders of Bioware, Greg Zetchuk and Ray Musica, left the studio they started almost 2 decades earlier. At the time, they would state they were ready for retirement or some other new adventure, but years later it became clear it was because of the fan backlash to The Old Republic and the ending of Mass Effect 3. Zetchuk stated, "The fire just wasn't there anymore." It's one of the saddest moments in gaming history, and something Bioware would never recover from. That same year, in November 2012, Bioware Mythic once again got restructured and given a new, or old, name, since they went back to being called Mythic Entertainment. Sadly, that didn't last very long because only 2 years later, on May 29 of 2014, EA did what EA does best and shut them down forever. And just a few months later, on August 7, 2014, longtime Bioware legend and Mass Effect creator Casey Hudson left the studio stating he felt the franchise was in good hands and he was ready for a new challenge. As we would sadly soon find out, his departure marked the end of one of the greatest video game franchises of all time. Bioware still had one last success story up its sleeve. Led by Mike Laidlaw, produced by Mark Dara, and written by David Gator, Dragon Age Inquisition released on November 18, 2014. The game was met with critical praise, even won Game of the Year, and became the fastest-selling Bioware title of all time. But the audience never truly fell in love with it. It was the first Dragon Age game featuring a full open world, which gave us back the freedom that was sorely lacking in Dragon Age 2. But the problem was that the world felt empty and soulless. It was almost like you were playing a single-player MMO with endless checkboxes that needed to be ticked before you were allowed to experience the real game. The tactical combat camera made a glorious return, but the combat itself was just fine. The new characters and their personal quests were also fine. The war table, a new gameplay mechanic where you could send out forces in order to gather resources or other materials, was fine. The typical Bioware choices and consequences were fine. In every regard, Dragon Age Inquisition was fine. It was a good game, but it lacked the heart and soul of the previous ones. Nothing would make that more obvious than the game's villain, Corypheus. The lore behind him and the Inquisition itself was awesome, but it's the execution which was just, again, fine. It wasn't until the third and final DLC called Trespasser where Dragon Age Inquisition finally reached its full potential. It was released on September 8, 2015, but by then, most of the audience had moved on to something far superior. So not even a year after launch, Dragon Age Inquisition already felt pretty dated and put the franchise in a tough spot it would remain at for the next decade. After Dragon Age Inquisition, things went downhill quickly. On January 6 of 2016, longtime writer David Gator left Bioware without much explanation. He had been working on a new mysterious game called Anthem, but as soon as he left, the entire game got rewritten. Only years later, in 2023, Gator would elaborate through a series of tweets stating that he felt that writers were being resented at Bioware, which prompted Gator to sadly leave the development studio he was with for over a decade. Bioware's Golden Team was slinking rapidly. A year later, on March 21st of 2017, Bioware Montreal released their very first completely in-house developed game called Mass Effect Andromeda. Look, I'm gonna be very short about this one. The game got railed at launch because of bugs and weird animations, but the true problem was that it had no soul. The writing wasn't on par with previous Bioware games, including Inquisition, and the lore behind it was pretty lazy. It borrowed from practically every sci-fi movie in existence, but the gameplay, however, was really good, with great shooting mechanics, powers, and decent exploration. The game wasn't bad, it just wasn't Mass Effect. So this was the game where the audience realized that Bioware might have lost its charm. There was only one man who could save the sinking ship that was Mass Effect. So on July 18, 2017, Casey Hudson made his glorious return to Bioware, only this time as its general manager. Meanwhile, writer Mike Laidlaw had worked himself up to be the director on the long-awaited Dragon Age sequel codenamed Joplin, until suddenly the project was cancelled and the whole team got shifted over to aid in the development of Anthem. Shortly after, Dragon Age 4 got rebooted and codenamed Morrison. This caused another one of Bioware's Golden Team to leave the studio, and on October 13, 2017, Mike Laidlaw closed the doors behind him. Only 9 months later, on June 14, 2018, designer James Olin followed his example and left the studio he was with for over 2 decades, tweeting that he wanted to work on something smaller and more personal. Bioware's Golden Team was now almost completely gone, and only the returned son Casey Hudson and longtime veteran Mark Dara remained. On February 22, 2019, Bioware was ready to launch their next game, or so they thought. Anthem, however, became their worst nightmare. Before the game even launched, everyone already knew about the many development issues, the staff leaving, the lacking live service elements, and the story that kept getting reworked. The game wasn't that great, but what made it worse is that no one was surprised by it. So when it finally launched and the low review scores came pouring in, it became clear that the glory days of Bioware were now truly behind them. And on December 3rd, 2020, while the whole world was in lockdown, the last 2 remaining Bioware veterans, Mark Dara and the returned son Casey Hudson, left the studio they were with for all these years. After 22 years of game development history, creating some of the most important and successful games the world had ever seen that still resonate and get sequels to this day, Bioware's Golden Team was gone. And so here we are, my friends, in 2024, at the brink of the launch of a new Dragon Age game. One that isn't without controversy, public outrage, or the typical bad marketing. Why is there an audio drama? Who is this catering to? And then the next day they put up this awesome high-level gameplay, so everyone's excited again. It makes no sense. But that's the marketing's fault, and not the game itself, because against all odds, I have faith in Dragon Age 4. Now, besides the gameplay looking awesome, there are a couple of very important key elements that give me hope. And one of them is Mark Dara, because even though he left in 2020, they recently rehired him as a narrative consultant, which makes me hopeful that there's at least the intention of tying the entire series together instead of just focusing on new players. The second element are the hidden members of the team. I know I focused on a handful of them in this video, the big names, but there are also still a few people working at Bioware who've been with Dragon Age from the very start and know the lore inside out. Dragon Age the Veilguard also doesn't appear to be too rushed or crunched, but rather made with love and care. Yes, the team working on it might be largely new, but so was Bioware's Golden Team at one point. If you listen to what the developers have to say and the way they're showing off the game, again, not like this, they sound pretty confident in it. Now these days that might not always be a positive, but what they've shown so far of the actual game looks impressive and respectful to its rich history. But the main reason I think, or hope I should say, Dragon Age 4 is going to be at least good, is because it has to be. This is it. This is the one they need to nail, or they could very well be in trouble. We don't have to beat around the bush. Again, I used to love Bioware, but the past decade hasn't been exactly kind to them. The bad reception to their last two games, alongside all the internal struggles, firings, turnovers, and reorganizations, certainly didn't do them any favors. But Bioware needs and deserves a redemption arc, and it could, or should, start right here. Hopes, dreams, and weird marketing aside, the biggest problem Dragon Age 4 is facing is something we haven't talked about yet, and that's last year's revelation. Baldur's Gate 3 turned out to be one of the greatest RPGs of all time, and was ironically but rightfully called the true successor to Dragon Age Origins, with many similarities between the two games. Developer Larian was subsequently crowned the new Bioware, ending the company's almost 3-decade-long reign. So the real question is, does Bioware have what it takes to sit on the throne once again, or do they lose it forever? We'll find out in a couple of weeks on October 31st, and personally, I can't wait. I believe in them. Please don't let me down. If you somehow made it this far, thank you. What started out a month and a half ago as a simple Dragon Age 2 review just kept getting bigger and bigger. Once I finished the game and did my research, the striking similarities with the Veilguard kept me up at night, and I just had to expand on it, so my apologies for the late upload. I'll move a little faster now and take a short break from these big and heavy RPGs I've been playing over the past 6 months. So I'll be back in exactly 2 weeks, yes, so help me God, 2 weeks, with a review and comparison to the original of Mafia Definitive Edition. I also just finished my 4th and final playthrough of Baldur's Gate 3 and about to start my final approach to Starfield, so over the following weeks and months I'll have much more to come. So until then, have a great time, my friends.